Hi everyone, welcome to the Curious World of Alice. A few months ago, I was on a cruise ship that became international news overnight, and it's called the Diamond Princess. We were one of the first ships that did not allow passengers to disembark due to COVID-19 infections. And today, I will be sharing with you some of the day-to-day details that occurred over those 14 plus days. Sometime in the afternoon, the captain announces that we will be arriving to Yokohama much earlier than anticipated to begin the disembarkation process. Now that wasn't a surprise to us because in our last port, Okinawa in Japan, they delayed our disembarkation to tour the town because there was a new quarantine protocol and it just took a lot more steps before you could get off the ship. Internet was made available for us for free so that we could contact our family and friends about the delays. Now this is a big deal because internet on cruise ships are about 14 American dollars per 24 hours per device. And that's the basic package. Anything more can be 25 plus American dollars. Now it's common practice on Princess Cruises where you receive a luggage tag that designates what time and which area and how you would like to disembark based on your personal preferences, and then you put this tag on your luggage and push it out into the hallway. Now we did that as if things were normal, and our cabin steward not long after pushed our luggages back into your room, and so did all the luggages. And some of the people who had early dinner were not aware of the changes and they were extremely confused and ended up pushing their luggages back out into the hallway. Meanwhile, the entertainment group distributed a makeshift schedule of activities for the next day as if it was a normal sea day. Later that evening, the captain made another announcement saying that every passenger and crew on board will be health screened by Japanese authorities. Our temperatures were taken as well as a questionnaire was required to be filled out. If you didn't have signs or symptoms, then you were not to be tested. That morning, we were hopeful that we would make it for our 7 p.m. flight. It was only later in the day that the captain had announced that we should all cancel our flights, but at that moment, they hadn't announced that they would cover our cost. So it was a bit stressful because rebooking was going to cost us up to 9,000 Canadian dollars per ticket. We didn't know how many hours we were going to stay on the ship, let alone days, and Princess Cruises didn't want to announce anything that they were uncertain of. So I had to go downstairs to the reception area to figure out whether I had to book a hotel for that evening. And the only thing they were certain is that we were going to stay on the ship. At 8 a.m. that morning, the captain had announced that we need to all return to our cabins immediately and he'll make a subsequent announcement in 15 minutes. The second announcement was that we were going to be quarantined for a minimum of 14 days and we need to stay in our cabins until further notice. You need to understand that I hadn't had breakfast that morning and my first concern is how will I make it happen? We normally don't get room service except for that meal, and even then, most passengers don't eat in their rooms. This was going to be a logistical nightmare for the cruise ship and they needed a solution immediately. They tried their very best to serve all of us within a reasonable amount of time. On the first day, it definitely was a struggle. They were trying to figure out what to do or how to do it. We mostly received a lot of carbs for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. It was the same exact meal. And even for breakfast, they did it as fast as possible, but some people received that meal at around 1 p.m. The tap water on ships are not potable. And as you can imagine, typically you just get served beverages when you're in the dining room. and now they don't really have that supply to deliver all these water to us. At that point, I accepted or thought that it was a possibility we weren't even going to leave that cabin the entire quarantine, which made it easier to emotionally handle because that was worst case scenario. And at one point in time of that day, I also heard a lot of on my neighbor's door. It turns out they had left their room and there was a crew that was monitoring the hallway, and I guess he saw that they left the room. So when they finally reappeared, he said, "I am monitoring you guys and you need to be in your room." Because no one really knew how to properly handle the situation and there was no protocol, the crew member that was providing our breakfast was very scared and he did his very best, but under his fear, he extended his arm really, really far and quickly asked us to close the door. The ship had already improved a lot in their logistics. For example, they provided 3 options per meal, but you had to select that the night before. Not the biggest deal. It's already as good as it gets under these very difficult circumstances. As for myself, I ended up sleeping a lot because when you're cabin bound and you really have very limited space to move, you don't exert a lot of energy, there's not much to do, and we didn't even have a window, so there was no sense of time. And I lost my appetite for the first couple of days, especially from not moving. Day 3 was a very special day because that's when the captain announced that we were now allowed to go out on open deck during allocated time. The instructions were you had to stay 1 meter away from everyone, and we were provided a mask and gloves. They started with interior cabins of each deck, and then it was only in the later days that they went to the cabins with balconies. We were also provided with 1 thermometer each and asked to check our temperature regularly, and if it was higher than 37.5 Celsius, to report it to a specific designated phone line on the ship. And that night we had to go back out to sea because for the ship to operate normally, its water and wastewater system needs the ship to be moving. The ship seemed to have a much bigger wave motion than it normally does. So whenever it required to go back out to sea, I actually felt seasick during the quarantine. At this point, we were thinking about laundry. Most of the clothes that you were wearing every single day were probably your pajamas or sweatpants. The captain had announced that the laundry service would be available for everybody. At this point, there was still a lot of science to be discovered or understood on this virus, so we felt that it was best if we hand washed our own clothes. They did provide laundry detergent to each room. I think the biggest challenge was not knowing exactly when we would go on deck. Yes, I mean, you're always available in the room just waiting around, but it still feels uneasy.
A very good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is the officer of the watch speaking from the bridge. We are ready to call our next group of guests for some time on the open decks. Guests in all inside staterooms on Aloha Deck, Deck 12.
The ship had also organized for medication prescriptions to be filled. This was a free service that Japanese authorities also helped in distributing, but there were challenges for people who needed this because the prescriptions were done in English and sometimes it would be lost in translation and not the same brands would be available and some active ingredients would be missing. And because there were hundreds of prescriptions, it took several days before they managed to get all the medication to everyone. There was an announcement to notify passengers that had balconies not to feed birds, which was extremely amazing and amusing. But I guess at that point, when you feel so isolated from the outside world, even seeing an animal flying nearby, you really want that interaction and that engagement. There were still minor changes in the protocol, so eventually we were also asked to have our masks on when we opened the door to receive our food or for other room services. After many days of being cabin bound, I ended up starting dreaming about opening the door. It became reality and a dream. It almost was so intense and vivid, but it was a mix. It was eventually they started testing certain demographics. They started with 80 plus years old. Once that group was done, they ended up testing all the 70 plus years old. In the meanwhile, every single morning, the captain announced how many passengers were infected. And to be reassuring, he did say that it is expected that the number would increase because of the 14-day delay for symptoms to be appearing. Also, after each test, it takes 2 to 3 days before the results come back. So even when you hear a number that day, it really means that the person was infected a few days ago. And getting the people off the ship was another challenging event because at first they would have each infected person get onto an ambulance that brought them to 5 different hospitals across Japan. And you have to think about these hospitals being all over the place, and they have to bring the ambulances back. Eventually, they just didn't have the capacity to do it at such a slow rate anymore, because sometimes when you get 70 infected passengers in a day, it takes more than 24 hours to get them all off. So after several days of quarantine, they started having people go on buses. For those who smoked, it must have been a little bit traumatizing for them to go through the quarantine on the first few days because balcony smoking is prohibited. The only relief that the cruise ship was able to provide was either gum or nicotine patches. And here are footages of the few interviews that I accepted.
Well, they gave us some origami sheets, very Japanese culture of them. They also gave us some puzzles. This is on a daily basis. And they also hand out some Sudoku and international news. They have also started giving us the real newspaper that is in English. The Japanese authorities have provided a lot of medical staff to assist, and they board our ship and have been staying here with us. I think in total there's about 100 of them, including doctors, nurses, and pharmacists. The ship did provide a phone number for any mental health discussions, and it's a off-ship phone line. They provided a few additional channels, so there's live TV, mostly news stations. Then there are a lot of movies and some TV shows that are available for you to watch. And the captain reassures us that it's 100% fresh air into every cabin in this ship.
And sometimes they asked me dramatic shit like this.
Does your story look like a movie or a nightmare? I would say if this was an actual movie, it would be pretty boring.
I had a wonderful journalist named Sarah that contacted me via Twitter whether I would be interested in helping her with a podcast about this quarantine, and I was ecstatic because I'm a huge fan of all types of podcasts. And she is in Spain working for a public radio station, and I love the Canadian public radio station, so it was almost a dream come true. I really enjoyed the experience, but more importantly, it gave me almost a sense of purpose. I began to ask my mom to be quiet on a regular basis, and sometimes this duration would be so long that she forgets that I asked her to be quiet, but she was always so accommodating, never questioned it. And I think if it were anybody else, they wouldn't be so tolerant of my requests. But I do have to say that my mom is such a saint. I think she just does such a good job at managing our dynamic, and we really got along, I would say 99% of the time. One of the funny anecdotes that happened was while I was speaking to a dear friend of mine. After a little while, I said I have to go, and she was really surprised because in her mind, I'm just stuck in a room at all times. So she said, "Where do you have to go?" So I said, "Breakfast had arrived and I have to eat." It's really funny, but understandably for people to think that nothing really happened, and how do you spend so much time all day being stuck in a cabin? And I think in that moment, what was really such a blessing is I had so many family and friends reach out to me and offer me their subscriptions to a magazine or a game. Like, they really tried to help me as much as possible. But even more interestingly enough, I didn't feel like I needed any additional activities, but I also wasn't able to tell you what I really spent my time doing. On day 10, we received an email from the Canadian Embassy saying that they are there to assist us in any possible way. The Japanese authorities had also issued each cabin an iPhone 6S that would remain on the ship,
loaded with an application prepared by Japanese carrier SoftBank and messenger company Line.
and this had an app that was installed in order for you to acquire any medical information or need any medical assistance. However, it was challenging for the inside cabins to make any use of it because we couldn't get any signals. The captain also announced that Japanese authorities is mandating that every passenger and crew gets tested before they are allowed to get off the ship. Actually, if you get tested positive, you get sent to the hospital. And at that moment, although they changed this direction later, if you had a roommate that was tested positive, you were to start your quarantine over on the day that they are escorted to the hospital. The challenge of getting tested is at that point, we were nearing the end of our quarantine, and they also announced that you only get your results 2 to 3 days after you get tested, and that it would take up to 3 days for everyone on the ship to get tested. So you're really hoping that you're one of the earlier ones so you can be leaving the ship on time. On day 12, we receive an email from the Canadian Embassy saying that they will come rescue us. The date and time is to be determined, but we need to RSVP right away whether we're interested in the service. And most importantly, we need to remain on the ship even when we are allowed to disembark, because once we disembark, then we won't be allowed to be on this flight. In the morning, the US military came on board to talk to every single American citizens. And if they did not have signs and symptoms and were not tested positive for the COVID-19 test, then they could go home, although not everyone chose to do so. And more importantly, it was challenging logistically because they were the first country to leave. So passengers ended up staying on the bus for 5 hours before they were able to board the flight. On day 13, initially this was the day that the Canadian chartered flight was supposed to pick us up. And there was a brief Twitter message from our foreign minister saying that our flight is stuck in Portugal, which is difficult to wrap our heads around, but that was the commercial chartered flight that they got. I later learned that there's a lot of politics involved on who and when do countries get to pick up their citizens. Day 14 rolls around, we don't hear any updates from the Canadian Embassy. Day 15, this was officially the end of the quarantine. In order to disembark, you needed a certificate issued by the Japanese authorities stating that you were tested negative. You were not notified on when you would receive this certificate, so the first group of people who disembarked were elderly Japanese. The disembarkation procedure took some time. You had to go through several processes of administrative work, as well as once you're off the ship, you gave your passport to Canadian authorities until you landed back in Trent. As we were boarding the bus, everyone that we saw were also still suited in personal protective equipment and very well protected. The bright side of being one of the later countries to leave is that they now logistically knew a bit better on how to manage us. We ended up being on the bus for a couple of hours before it left to the airport, and they had organized a bathroom on the ship for us to board the ship again, just to go to the bathroom and come back out. We boarded the ship through another door to go to the bathroom, but it was a very simple procedure. At this point, I have been in some form of isolation for nearly my entire year of 2020. But I am not defeated, and I will be back on another cruise. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. It really helps with the YouTube robot algorithm. And until next time, bye everyone!